Just over a week ago, Sydney opened the second phase of its new metro system, extending the city's existing metro line 15.5 kilometres from Chatswood in the city's north, across the harbour, into the city's central business district or CBD, and then onto its new final destination of Sydenham in the inner west. The opening of this new line has been met with, to almost put it mildly, an overwhelmingly positive response. The system has been receiving praise all over social media, even from people who don't usually care that much about this sort of thing. It's been praised for the design of its stations, which people have described as having an epic and grand feeling, with lots of high ceilings and visual flourishes like this cool mural, that make the stations feel spacious and modern. People have also been praising the futuristic feeling of the trains themselves, which feature fully accessible walk-through carriages, and because they're automatic and have no driver, you can sit up front for a cool first-person view of them running through the tunnels. Now, it's one thing for the system to look cool, but it's another for it to provide some actual practical benefits. And people are getting excited about those practical elements as well, like its turn up and go frequencies and of course its speed. The metro is simply a lot faster than Sydney's existing train network. A trip from Chatswood across the harbour to the Sydney CBD on the T1 North Shoreline is scheduled to take just under 20 minutes, whereas the metro can make a similar trip in only 10. And on the other side, from Sydenham to Central stations, making the trip on the metro will take less than half the time that same trip would have taken on the old T3 line. Now, a lot of these speed increases are coming from the fact that, in both these cases, the metro simply needs to make less stops than the existing train line, which is, to be fair, part of the point. But a lot of these increases are also coming from the more modern track design, that has gentler curves which allows trains to go faster, as well as from the trains themselves, which are just smaller and lighter, and thus able to accelerate faster than Sydney's big and heavy double-deckers. However, amongst all the anecdotal praise the metro has been receiving, and there is a lot of that, there are actual numbers that point to the system being a success as well. Within its first week of being open, the metro carried an average of around 200,000 passengers each day, a number that, according to the state government, has exceeded expectations. It is interesting to note that when Phase 1 of the line opened, passenger numbers also exceeded expectations, so maybe we're just underestimating how many Sydneysiders will choose to take public transport when good options become available to them. As they say, if you build it, they will come. With that said, the new metro extension doesn't stand alone. It's part of a continuous series of improvements Sydney has been making to its public transport network. And while it's easy to see projects like this in isolation, the reality is that in recent years Sydney has really ramped up its investment into expanding its public transport infrastructure. If we look back at the last decade, which is conveniently just long enough for me not to have to include the closure of Sydney's monorail in this list, RIP, we can see a decade full of major improvements for public transport in the city. Starting in 2014 with the extension of the L1 light rail line from Lilyfield to Dulwich Hill. This extension saw the line's length almost double and 9 new stops added to it. On top of that, it also added a new interchange between the line and Sydney's heavy rail network at Dulwich Hill. A year later, in 2015, the South West Rail Link opened, adding 11 kilometres of new track and 2 new stops to Sydney's heavy rail network at Edmondson Park and Leppington in the city's southwest. 2 years later, in 2017, it saw a big update to Sydney Trains' timetable, which probably doesn't sound like that big of a deal, but this change saw 1,500 new services added to the timetable each week, and resulted in some 71% of Sydney's stations getting all-day turn-up-and-go style frequencies. That same year also saw the launch of the B1 bus line, which aimed to improve and simplify transport to Sydney's northern beaches, by consolidating a bunch of express bus services into a single, fast and frequent limited stop service. Though I'm not going to consider this change to be quite as positive as the others, as what we ended up getting was quite watered down from the original proposals, that could have seen a proper bus rapid transit system built. Also in my view, with its good frequencies, bus lanes and onboard stop announcements, I think the B1 is providing what we should consider to be the standard level of service for Sydney buses, rather than some special level of service that needs its own name and branding. That said, 2 years later in 2019, Sydney saw the biggest addition to its railway network in decades, with the opening of the first phase of the Sydney Metro, running from Tallawong in the city's northwestern suburbs through to Chatswood on the North Shore. This first phase of the line not only showed what was possible with the metro, but it also greatly expanded access to the city's rail network, finally giving the city's fast-growing northwestern suburbs a much-needed rail connection. It's this first phase that, in my view, really set Sydney Metro apart from other similar transport projects like the Metro Tunnel in Melbourne or Cross River Rail in Brisbane. Because while all of these projects focus on boosting capacity and reliability in their city's CBDs, only the Sydney Metro has done this at the same time as expanding rail coverage to the city's outer suburbs, where better public transport is needed the most. 2019 was overall a pretty busy year for Sydney's transport network, because just a few months later, the City and South East Light Rail's L2 line opened, along with the newly pedestrianised George Street in the CBD. This line runs from Circular Quay through the CBD and out to Randwick, and was joined a few months later in early 2020 by the L3 line, which runs along much the same route through the CBD but branches off towards Kingsford instead. These two lines weren't met with quite as positive a reception when they launched, because of their initially quite slow speeds. But the speeds have been improved and patronage on those lines have picked up. Now, this brings us to 2024 and the most recent addition to the network with the opening of Phase 2 of the Metro, which, as we've already seen, has been quite successful. But Sydney isn't stopping there. The next decade is looking to be just as jam-packed with new transport infrastructure as the previous one. In just the next few weeks or months, Sydney will see the opening of another new light rail line, that being the first phase of the Parramatta Light Rail, also called the L4. Then, in the next year or so, Sydney will get the third and final, for now, phase of the Metro project, that will see the line extended over the existing tracks between Sydenham and Bankstown. This will mean frequent metro services for passengers along that line, but because that line will no longer run through the city circle, it will also see service improvements for passengers on Sydney's other train lines, particularly the T2 and the T8. However, that's not the only metro line currently under construction. Around 2026, another metro line is set to open in Sydney's Outer West, a 23-kilometre long line comprising 6 stations that will connect St Mary's Station with the upcoming Western Sydney Airport. And while I might have some issues with the way this line is being built, which I'll probably cover in a future video, it is undoubtedly great to see Western Sydney Airport getting a rail connection from the start. But that too is also not the only other metro line under construction, because by 2032 it will be joined by Sydney Metro West. That's going to be adding a new 10-station link between Sydney's main CBD in the east and its second CBD in Parramatta. And as some icing on the cake, that same year should see the opening of the second stage of the Parramatta Light Rail, that will see it branch off towards the Olympic Park precinct. There have even been calls for this stage of the line to go as far as Lidcombe, but we'll have to wait and see if that happens. But while that might be most of what's been scheduled so far for this coming decade, the plans for even more future improvements keep going, with ideas that range from connecting up the Northwest Metro with St Mary's, or extending Sydney Metro West all the way out to Western Sydney Airport. But these proposals have yet to be confirmed. That said, even without those particular plans, it's clear to see that Sydney is on a massive transit improvement streak, and I personally can't think of any other Anglosphere city that's making as big strides when it comes to public transport infrastructure. I don't even think it to be that hyperbolic to describe Sydney as going through a new transit golden age, which is fantastic to see because it's showing a change in priority for politicians who, for the last half a century, have been happy to spend big on car infrastructure at the expense of transit. It's also great these projects are being met with such enthusiasm from the public, because it shows that Sydneysiders have an appetite for good quality public transport, and that if it gets built, they will come out and use it and be excited to do so, which should hopefully encourage those politicians to keep this momentum up. And keeping this momentum up is important. Sydney has come a long way, but there is still room for improvement, as some 32% of Sydneysiders still don't live near a frequent all-day public transport service. With the higher interest rates we're experiencing at the moment, governments are going to be more hesitant to splurge on high-cost projects. But in my view, that makes it all the more important that what infrastructure projects are funded are actually useful, like the Sydney Metro, and don't actively make things worse like the very expensive WestConnex project did. There is also an opportunity to look at smaller projects, like improving the bus network, which has been a bit neglected in all of this, but could see some big gains for quite a low cost. Ultimately, I hope the immediate success and positive reception the new phase of the Sydney Metro has received will encourage the government to keep this momentum going, and along with all these other projects, allow Sydney to keep expanding its mass transit network. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. And if you really liked it, consider supporting me on Ko-fi. Any support is always appreciated. But as always, I'm City Moose. Thanks for watching.